Hello, my name is Chris Keyack with Keyack Technology Solutions. In this video today, I'm going to cover a little bit about the Tekla PowerFab API and show you how to get started. Now, I'm going to be programming everything with the C# programming language and using the Windows.NET framework. And I'm going to be working in Visual Studio, which is the development environment for creating those applications and for writing the code. And if you're just getting started in programming, then I would highly recommend that you do a search online for Visual Studio Community Edition. And that's actually the free edition of Visual Studio for you to get started with. Now, there are other development environments, but this is the most commonly deployed and used for C# programming, as well as for working with like kind of Windows Forms and Windows.NET framework apps like I'm going to show here. So I would highly recommend that. Now, one other thing to clarify is I have not tested whether or not the PowerFab API can actually be used in a .NET Core app. I'm using the old school Windows.NET framework and creating WinForms applications. And most of the examples that I've seen from Trimble and Tekla are also doing the same thing. So I'm not sure if their API actually has some dependencies on the Windows.NET framework, and I'm not sure if .NET Core can be used or not. Now, as far as if you're new to programming itself, then I highly recommend that you first go through some basics of the C# programming language and just make sure you get some understanding of how that works, because then it'll make a lot more sense when you're looking at some of the code examples that I'm going to go through here specifically with the PowerFab API. If you actually go to my YouTube channel, there's a playlist here called C# Training. And if you look at that playlist, it goes step by step, even if you've never programmed before. It talks about how to get started with Visual Studio, creating your first application, declaring some variables, going through if-then statements, logic, loops, and iterators, and things like that. So it's a great way for you to get started. And again, it's free. It's right there available. And it's a great way to understand programming before you come over here and actually start working with the PowerFab API. Now, the next step is you want to actually go search online for the Tekla PowerFab API. And you should see at the very top a result saying getting started with the PowerFab API. If you actually click on that, it brings you to the Tekla Developer Center, which is really a great resource. It's actually got API references here. It's got some startup video, tells you a little bit about how the API works, some download links. And at the very bottom, which we're going to actually show and I suggest for you to download, is this Tekla PowerFab API code example. So I would click on that link and download that, and that'll give you a Visual Studio project for you to work with and take a look at some of the things that you need to understand in order to get started. And I'm actually going to walk through that, and I'm going to cut and paste a few different things from that in my first application. Now, just scrolling back up, if you're an experienced developer, if you go to the API references, that's actually going to show you all of the class libraries with the documentation for all the classes, the methods, and all of the properties on those classes. Basically, everything that you need to know related to the API. You may see it called Fab Suite up at the top if you're new to Tekla PowerFab. That used to be the original product name, and so the API might kind of still be named that in some of the documentation. Then you might also see Tekla EPM here and there. That was the name of it before it now became Tekla PowerFab. So just be aware of that. Fab Suite, Tekla EPM, and Tekla PowerFab, they're all relating and going towards the same product, which is Tekla PowerFab. All right, so if we go back up here and go back to documentation again, what's interesting is it actually switches you to a slightly different page than the landing page. And there are some great code examples here, and it walks you through those. And I really like these examples because they are pretty close to real-world integration examples that third-party developers like CNC equipment and things like that would do, or you as user developers or partner developers might actually get in there and do outside of PowerFab, but want to not only read data from PowerFab, but actually update and send information to PowerFab. So the Tekla PowerFab API is pretty much structured like a web service API, and that somewhat makes sense. If you think of the Tekla PowerFab Go product, it opens up in web browsers and then basically uses its own API to pull and push data from the Fabricator's Tekla PowerFab database. That's whether they're an internal user inside of the local area network or if they're outside of the firewall as an external user. But basically, to call into the PowerFab database, it uses like kind of a structure and calls very similar to what you're used to in a web-based API. And basically in PowerFab's API, there are two major, I would say, verbs if you're, again, used to using like the like REST API interface or web service API. There's the ability to do a request, and then there's also to get a response. Now, the whole idea behind requests is whether you're just fetching data from the API or if you're actually trying to do updates and post changes to something in the PowerFab database, then you're going to use this request section of the API to do either one of those. So if I'm just fetching a list of jobs, I'm going to use request. If I'm going to actually save updated status data in PowerFab, I'll still use a request to do that. And the response is either going to give me that fetched data, like the list of jobs or list of cut lists or list of drawings, or it'll give me a status of the update or the change that I made in the PowerFab database. So you'll also notice here that all of the requests as well as the responses are pretty much going to be structured in XML. And this is pretty common in web-based APIs. You're going to see that either the data and the instructions and the responses are either sent as XML or in JSON. And in this particular case, the PowerFab API uses XML, and you can see that here. Now, this example here you see in the XML is that which again, this is pretty common with web-based APIs, is that I need to connect to the appropriate PowerFab database for a specific fabricator. And so you basically pass the IP address where that's hosted, the port that you're accessing that through, as well as the username and password credentials. Now, this is slightly different whether you're an internal user versus an external user leveraging the API. If you're in the local area network, then you can just use the server and the port there. And I'm going to show you that here in a minute. And if you're an external user, you actually have to be set up and then use the external port socket that you'll see me show you here in a moment. But this just shows you like basically what I would pass as a request and then the response that I would get basically if everything worked okay. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you that in basically in the API documentation, it talks about this application here where you can actually directly run the XML commands for the requests and responses. So you can test the API before you even start using the .NET and the C# portion of the API. So that's actually in the installation folder here. So let me actually go to that. And it might be in your Tekla PowerFab folder. So C program files, x86, Tekla, and either Tekla EPM or Tekla PowerFab, depending on when you installed PowerFab or EPM. And there's this tekla.powerfab.interface.test.exe. So there's this neat little executable. If you fire this up, it actually lets you copy and paste some of the examples here. And then you can, post those requests and then look at what the responses are from the API. So the very first thing I need to do, and it's great, it's got a good example here, is I need to actually get myself authenticated so I can get access to my PowerFab database. Now, this port number is actually a little bit different on my setup because I'm using port 3305. So I'll change that here in the XML. And then the username, I'll just go ahead and say admin. And then I'll set the password to fab. And I'll go ahead and say submit request at the bottom. There, it shows me that, hey, this was successful. So it gives me an XML response and I would process that response in my code. And now I can actually start doing things like fetching jobs or updating things in the PowerFab database now that I've connected to it. And I can see that that's been successful. So I just wanted you to see this as well, that there's this additional testing. And sometimes it's easier to just look at the raw XML, see what the data you're getting. And then that way you can make sure you understand which classes and things that you're supposed to be using with the .NET portion of the API. So now I'm in Visual Studio and I'm going to create a brand new Windows Forms application using the .NET framework. And this is going to show you how to reference in the PowerFab API to get started with your first application. Now to do that, I'm going to go to Create New Project in Visual Studio. And again, I was saying earlier that I'm going to use the Windows.NET framework and I'm going to do a WinForms application. You could also do WPF if you prefer. The only thing that I don't know of is if the API can actually be used in a .NET Core app. And so that's why I'm using the .NET framework here. So I'll select that option and press next. And then I can give it a name. So I'll just call it PowerFab Sandbox, something like that. Okay. And then what I can do is I can specify where I want this to be located. So I'll do that. Now there's the .NET framework. And that's how I know, like when I see this old 4.6, 7, 8, etc. This shows me that this is the Windows Forms, or not Windows Forms, sorry, the Windows.NET framework and not the .NET Core frameworks to leverage from. Now, I'm not sure exactly what the API DLL from PowerFab was built in, like what version or what framework its dependencies are on, but I've been able to use this in like version 4.6 of the .NET framework, which is pretty close to what the sister product of Tekla Structures leverages. And so I haven't had any problems with that. If you go too old or too new, then some computers may not have the latest .NET framework, or if it's too old of a framework that you target, then that computer actually may not have that older version of the .NET framework. So you kind of got to be aware of this as time goes by. All right, so I'm just going to leave it at the 4.6.2, and I'm going to say create, and then it'll create my brand new project for me. Okay, so now the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm actually going to download from Nuget the PowerFab API DLL that works with C# and the .NET framework. Now to do that, I'm going to come up here to Tools, and then I'll go to Nuget Package Manager. I'll go to Manage Nuget Packages for Solution. Now I'll go to Browse here, and I'll do a search for Tekla PowerFab. Now that'll show me the PowerFab API. There are two different versions of that hosted online. I'm going to use the latest stable one, so 1.0.1. I'll select my solution and press the install button. Now it's going to just prompt me, hey, do I accept the terms and agreement for using the API? I'll go ahead and say yes. And then what that'll do is it'll actually download that package and add that DLL or that library of the API here to my project. And one thing is that I'll probably keep this copy local to true. So since this is a DLL or a library, that's actually that my executable or this application I'm creating is going to be dependent on, then it actually has to be deployed and copied into the same folder as the actual executable or the application itself. So if I come in here and go to Open Folder in File Explorer, I'll then go to the bin folder here, which is where the build is actually created. So if I go up in Visual Studio and say Build Solution, then it'll actually create the executable, and it copies the Tekla PowerFab API library or DLL into the same folder. So if I made an installer for this, then I would deploy both of those so that way my application can use that library of the PowerFab API. All right, so that shows you first how to get that referenced into your application, but then now we need to actually get the code for doing the requests as well as the responses. Now, one thing I'm going to do real quick is I'm going to create an ApplicationLogic class, and this is just kind of good programming housekeeping here, and I'll just call this ApplicationLogic. And the reason I'm doing this is that all the code that's actually going to do stuff with the PowerFab API, I'm going to do it in this particular class here, and that way I can keep my business logic separated away from the actual user interface. I don't want to code things directly underneath my form, which I see over here in my Solution Explorer and Project Explorer on the upper right. I'm basically going to just have that to process inputs from the user, but all my actual code is going to be here behind the scenes. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to say public class, and then I'll make a constructor of this. Looks good here. And then I'm actually going to come back to this here in a second, but I wanted to at least get that business logic class first made so that way I can reference the PowerFab API in here. Now, when you download a lot of the examples for the PowerFab API from the Tekla Developer Center online, they're going to have these two files already in there. So I just want you to be aware of that. So the thing is, though, is that they might be out of date because those examples may have been posted quite a long time ago. So if you have a newer version of PowerFab installed, you can go into the installation directory where PowerFab is on your computer. So C program files, x86 in this case here, Tekla and Tekla EPM, or this might say Tekla PowerFab, and then doc subfolder. Now, the XSD files that you see here for the request and the response, those are the XML schema definition files. Because all the requests and the response are actually structured in an XML data format, there needs to be a schema which defines the rules and the data structure in XML specifically for the PowerFab API. And so that's what these XSD files control. Now, what the PowerFab team have also done is they automatically generated C# classes and code or an API from those XML schema definition files. So that way, for me as a C# programmer, I don't have to worry about dealing with the XML requests and responses directly. I can just use C# to handle that, and then I'll just have some helper functions and methods that will deal with the XML part, so I never have to worry about that. Now, what I'm going to do is all I really need is the C# classes, but I can copy all of these if I want and say copy. And then what I'll do is inside of Visual Studio, I'll right click and say open file in Folder Explorer, and I'll paste these in here. And now I've got those inside of my Visual Studio project. I'll then right click and say add existing item. And then I'll select on the C# files and say add, and now they're available in my project. Now, if I double click on these, you're going to see that there's a namespace reference at the top of this. And I'm actually going to copy this for both the request as well as the response. And I'm going to add that to the top of the using statements here inside of my ApplicationLogic class. So I'll paste that there, and then I'll also do using, and I'll go grab the other one for the response. So I'll just grab this namespace reference here, and I will also paste that at the top of my ApplicationLogic class. So there we go. Now, the reason we've done that is so that way I don't have to fully declare like the whole namespace reference on classes and functions that I'm going to use with the PowerFab API. It'll respectively know which one lives in the request versus the response. So there we go. We've got that saved. And now we'll go ahead and take a look at actually getting started with and connecting to the PowerFab API. Okay, now what you can see here is that I've actually downloaded the Tekla PowerFab Open API example from the Tekla Developer Center. And I've opened that up here in Visual Studio. Now you're going to see that the Nuget package is already referenced here for the Tekla PowerFab API DLL or library. And then you can see that they've also already referenced in the C# files here. Now, if I open up this C# file, one thing I want you to notice that in this older example, the namespace is different than what I just showed you with the latest C# classes and the latest version of PowerFab. So this is why I wanted you to see that and what I had kind of done before, because I'm going to probably have issues with this when I'm trying to use these old examples but use the latest APIs. So you might just need to refactor this. You'll see what I'm talking about here in a second. But you can see that those C# files are in here. And then if I actually go down here to the Tekla PowerFab Open API example, this C# file is actually controlling the main form itself or the user interface. And there are 3 key buttons here. This actual application is ground zero. You need to have this understood in order to do anything else with the PowerFab API. We need to connect with our username and password to the appropriate PowerFab database. Then we'll fetch the production control jobs so that way we can get more information about any of those specific jobs. And then once we're all done, we will disconnect from the PowerFab database from our application and close this out. So if you actually double click on this connect button, that'll bring you to the code here underneath that is going to show you all the code specific with making that request. Now, before I even get to that, I'm going to scroll up at the top here. And the very first thing that I'm going to have to do in my code is I'm going to have to instantiate or create an instance of the actual PowerFab API. And this thing that I'm doing here, that's related to the PowerFab API DLL. And really, again, what this is doing most of the work of dealing with all the HTTP calls, like all the web calls in and out of the PowerFab database. It's handling all that for me. And I just need to instantiate this over inside of my code. The other thing, though, is that when I actually try to connect to the correct, appropriate PowerFab database for a specific fabricator, I'm going to need to know their IP address for that, the port, as well as my username and password credentials that I'm going to send to the PowerFab API to get access to that specific PowerFab database. So I'm going to copy these, right? So this is pretty much the bare bones and the basics of what I need in my application. So I'll go back over to my application and maybe I'll paste this up here at the top. And just to make these accessible, I might make these as public fields just so that way my user interface can get access to those. So I'll just do that here. And again, there might be a couple different ways to do this. Don't judge me on my coding. It's more just kind of showing the flow of the things that you need for the PowerFab API. So I definitely need this here. And again, if you see the Fab Suite, I think I've said this a couple times, but if not, if you see FS, that means Fab Suite, right? Same thing over here. That is just what Tekla PowerFab used to be called. That was the previous product name. And so you'll still see some references to that or Tekla EPM in basically the code libraries or some of the API URLs themselves. And so just be aware if you see that, that's what that means. But it's still talking about the same product, which is Tekla PowerFab. So now that I've got that there, I'm actually going to need to call this to do those fetches and those queries for the requests as well as process the responses. So we'll come back to that. Now, if I wanted to hard code in my application, just some specific information here, what I'm going to actually do is I'll put in the IP address. Like where do I go get that? Well, in my case, it's localhost. But let me just actually show you here in PowerFab. You can see I'm connected to localhost, and this is the port that I'm actually using. So if I'm in the local area network, which my computer that I'm on right now is acting as the server and a client user, then what I can do is I can just put in localhost and whatever that port number is. So let's say that I'll do that. So I'll just say localhost, or you can put in the specific IP address for that. And then for the port, I'll just do the 3305. Let me just double check on that. Yep, 3305 in my case, so I'll put that in there. Now, if just to keep this simple, I'm going to use basically admin as my username and fab, which is the out-of-the-box default administrator credentials for PowerFab, which I've never changed on my computer. But you can see that that is probably the easiest ground zero way of getting started. Now, if you're an external user, I'm going to show you that here in a second, but if you're an external user that's been given credentials, you'll fill in a different port number here and you'll put in your username and password, and it'll allow you to get access through the IP address to that specific PowerFab database as an external user that might not be on the local area network. So let me show you that next. Okay, so I'm back here in Tekla PowerFab, and I'm actually going to go up to File, and I'll go to Administration. So I'm logged in as an administrator here. And I'm going to go to external users, and you can see that I've actually added an external user. Now, my Trimble identity and my particular license doesn't allow, say, PowerFab Go or external users. And so I may not be able to demonstrate this to you, but once you create and set this up, you'll go to the remote permissions, and then you can choose what different credentials and things are that external user able to do. And the API will actually be restricted to that. So if based on these permissions, the API will or won't let you do certain things using these user credentials based on how this is actually set up, especially if you're using the remote login. So you'll set this up. Then the next thing we'll do is we'll actually go to the remote application here, the Tekla PowerFab Remote Monitor. And first thing you'll need to do is you'll need to go into settings, and you'll want to make sure that you're signed in with your Trimble identity, something that has like the full permissions of allowing administrator rights and kind of basically, I'd almost say like the administrator account for this, but I've signed in with that. And here's the key difference. So here is the port that I was actually using before for connecting into PowerFab. And this is if you're in the local area network, you would use localhost or whatever the IP address is and that port, and that's what you would pass. But if it's an external user, then you're actually going to pass this socket port here instead, and that will be passed rather than this port here for an external user. So this is just important for you to kind of take a look at and make sure that you see and that you have set up in order to allow external users and internal users to use the PowerFab API. Okay, so when we actually come back here to the code, that's going to make this local host make a lot more sense. That's the IP address, or here, because my client and my server are on the same computer, I'm using localhost. There's the port. And then here is my username and password for a user that's internal within the local area network. Now that I've got that set, the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to show you how to actually do the connecting to the PowerFab database itself. All right, now to do that, I'm going to come back here to the downloaded Tekla PowerFab Open API example that I got off of the Tekla Developer Center. I'm going to go back to that connect button to grab that code. Now I'm going to copy paste this code here over into my application because I like this and I'm going to reuse this, and we'll just refactor whatever we need to. So I'll copy that. I'll then go back to my other application. And because I'm doing all of my business logic in this separate application logic class, not in the main form UI, what I'm going to do is I'm going to just create a new method here, and we'll just say public string as the data that's going to be returned, and we'll say connect to PowerFab. Okay, so then what I'll do here is I'll just set a new string, and I'll just say status string, or just say status, I guess, and then return that at the end. Okay, so then what we'll do is we'll paste all of our code, and it looks like there's some warnings and errors here that we have to refactor. So the first thing is that the namespace references are different. So you'll see on the new versions of the response and the request C# files that it has a different namespace with the tekla.powerfab at the beginning. Well, what I could do is I could go in there and wipe all that out, but I'm just going to get rid of these so that way these warnings go away. So I'll do a quick find and replace, and I'll just replace those so that way those prefixes are not on there. And I'll just go to that. And then I need to do that also on the responses. So Control F, and we'll just say anything with that and a dot. We'll replace, and there we go. Now you'll see that those namespace prefixes are gone and the objects are good. Okay, a couple other small things to refactor here. First thing I see is that this is expecting a list, an array, not a list. So I've got to fix this. I mean, the fastest way is probably just to say toArray on that, and then since there's no add command on that, it's going to be 0 index in the array equals this connect command. So that's refactoring that to get rid of that problem. This execute command, I know what that is. It's basically we don't have that function or that method here in our code. So I'll explain that here in a second and I'll get that and we'll fix that last. Okay, so response XML error. Again, this is due to an array versus a list. The count doesn't look like it's working there, so I'll use .length instead. Does that work better? Yep, gives me, basically what I'm saying is if the XML error returns something, like, there was actually an error there, I'm going to tell you about that error in the response and warn the user about it. And rather than doing this whole show thing here with a message box, I'm just going to say status is going to equal that response. And since there can be multiple errors returned, that's why it's an array. And I'm just getting the 0 in these square brackets as the first XML error response in that array. And then down here, if everything is all good and everything connects okay, then I can just send a message to the user. So we'll just say status equals connected for that if everything goes well. And then if unknown exception happens, like I don't get an XML error, but still something doesn't properly connect, then what I can do is I can actually just send that information to the user as well through the status. So what I'll do is I'll just come in here and get rid of these message boxes. And I'll just say status equals that error response, close that out. And there we go. Now all the warnings and everything have gone away except for this execute command method or function that we need. Now, once you've refactored this, and you know that this works with the latest API and the latest namespaces, then you're just going to use this connect to PowerFab method over and over again. That's why I kind of spent the time in the video to go through this, because you want to get this tweaked and refined exactly the way you want, and you're just going to copy paste this and use this over and over again. All right, so now let's go ahead and take care of this execute command. And this is also something that you're going to use over and over again. So if I go back to the other code example here, we'll just select on that execute command. We'll right click and say go to definition. So let's just say go to definition of that method. And there we go. I'm actually going to take all of this method here, this whole code, and I'm going to take this. So I'll select that. I'll copy it. I'll put that over into my code base here as another basically method underneath there. So I'll paste that. Okay, and again, there's these namespace prefixes that we'll just find. Let's just find those everywhere if we need to and get rid of those. Okay, so that's all good. Let's see if there's any request ones. There is. Looks like there's just one here, so I'll just get rid of that manually. And I think we're in good shape. There's one more up there on the top. Just get rid of that. And I could have done some shortcuts to just do those namespace, but I just like getting rid of them so that I'm all set. And then there's one more method that looks like it's referenced. It's this namespace override XML. And this is more about the actual references to the schema and stuff like that for the PowerFab API. And so again, you'll never have to mess with this, but you should be able to just copy this whole method here, Control C from the example code, and then paste that here. And this is actually a different class. So I need to do that down here below since it's a different class than the actual application logic that I have. But now that that's being referenced here, let's see, to do the override right there, sorry. So see how that's being referenced. So I'm going through this, not necessarily trying to explain exactly what's going on with this and why you need to use them. This is, again, dealing with just an old URL, and the comments here actually explain what's going on with that. But I'm more just showing you the mechanical things that you need to have in your application so that way you have these taken care of and you never have to worry them again and you just copy paste this over and over again. And really this execute command, you'll see me use this all over the place. What this execute command is doing is it's taking care of all of the memory stream stuff, like converting this to from XML and serializing it or deserializing it into the C# classes. So it's handling all the XML dirty work, the stuff that you don't want to be doing over and over again as a programmer. You just want to be focused on the actual business logic of what you're doing. So you'll see that this execute command, you're going to use this all the time. You'll copy and paste this into every one of your apps. And every time you do, you want to get a response, you're going to call this execute command. You're going to pass the request to it, and then it's going to generate a response. And then you'll check if the response is an error or not. And then if it's not an error, then you'll see that if it's successful, and then you can actually process the data with that returned object. Okay, so that's pretty much how the structure of this works. And you're going to see me repeat the same structure again, like when I actually pull something from the PowerFab database, like jobs and things like that. So let's actually test and see if this works. I want to get this status returned to the user interface on the dialog box. So I'll go back to my form, and I'm going to add a nice little button here that just says connect. So I'll just change the text over here in the properties to connect. And then I'll just, as good habit, I'll just say button, and we'll say connect. Okay. And so now that I've got that there, we'll go ahead and do that. And then I just need a label. So I'm just going to come down here in my toolbox, and I'll drag and drop a label on here. And this will just be the status. So for the name of this, we'll call this label status in the properties. And we'll just say status for the default text. Okay. And then now, if I double click on this button, that'll create an event handler for that. And what am I going to do? First, I need to actually probably instantiate the ApplicationLogic class. So I'll say ApplicationLogic, and we'll just say ApplicationLogic. Here in the constructor, I can instantiate that. And then that's basically my business logic class that I was just working on. And I'm just making an instance of that I can communicate with from my Windows Form app. And then what I'll do is I'll just say ApplicationLogic dot connect to Tekla PowerFab. There's that method, or there's that function. And this is going to return a status string. So what I'll do is I'll just say label status.text equals the result of whatever the connect to PowerFab method does. So I'm calling that function, and it's going to tell me what the status is. All right, time to run it. So let's go ahead and say build solution. That'll make the executable. Then I can press the start button here, which will run that executable and debug it. And let me just say connect. And looks like I got an error here. So I got to figure out what happened. Looks like something about my code on how I'm doing the response on this. So let me just take a look at this and see what I did. All right, so my little hack here to do a to array did not do the trick. So I'm actually going to refactor this code. So we'll get rid of that, and we'll say that we're making an array that's new with that size. And now that should actually create an array that's long enough to add this request to, and then it should work. So let me just start that code again, which will build the executable, launch this, and if I press the connect button, it'll take a few seconds, but sure enough, there it is, connected. Woo! We have success. We've actually connected with our username and password to the Tekla PowerFab database, and now we're ready to fetch the jobs. Now, before we actually fetch the jobs, I'm going to show you how to disconnect your application from the PowerFab database. And maybe I'm going to do this on the close event of this application or this form. So if I select on the form in the designer, go over here to the properties, and then we'll go to the events, and there should be a form closed. So let me just scroll up and find form closed. So I'll just double click on that, and now it creates that form event handler for me. And so this is where I'm going to actually call the disconnect code. Now I'm going to go back to that example here. So let's go back to the example code, and we'll go back to the designer where those buttons are, and I'll just go to the disconnect button. All right, cool. So I'm going to just go ahead and take this code, and I will make a disconnect method over in my code. So just copy that, go back to my code here, and then in my application logic, I'll just make a new command here. So I've got connect to Tekla PowerFab, and then I'll just go ahead and make a new method here for disconnect. Okay. And then again, if I want a status string, I can just go ahead and say string, and we'll say string status equals empty, and return the status. Now, I'm going to go ahead and paste that code in here. And again, you have to refactor it kind of like what I did before. So I'm not going to do all that manually in front of you. You'll look at the warnings and the errors, and then you'll just get rid of those. It looks like it's mostly, again, these namespace prefixes. So I can just control find and then just replace those and get rid of those additional examples. And you'll see that those errors start to go away. All right, so most of the things that I had to fix were those namespace prefixes. I had to come down in here and deal with the array versus list issue. Same thing with this length here. And then I just replaced all the message box.shows with actually returning whatever the errors were to this status string that I'm going to return to the UI if I need to. So there we go. We got disconnect from PowerFab. That's all good. Let's just build and see if I get any more errors that I may have missed. Nope, build is completed, so that's great. And so what we need to do is just back here on our form one code where the form is closing, we'll just say application logic. And this is actually the instance of this, so we'll do lowercase there. and it will just say .disconnect from PowerFab. And we'll call that method when the form is closed, and then it should disconnect. So watch, now if I launch this, I can say connect. Shows that I'm connected. And then when I close the app, it's going to take a second or two, but then it'll disconnect from that PowerFab database and disconnect your application from the API. Now, for the sake of time, I've already added a couple elements to my user interface. So I added another button in here called Get Jobs, and I renamed it here to button_get jobs. And then I also added a list view, which is going to list out the return jobs. And so what I need to do is I need to map this button to do some code in my ApplicationLogic class. So I'm going to press on this. It creates an event handler. I'll just say ApplicationLogic. And right now, if I come in here to say get jobs, you'll notice that there's no function or no method for that. So that's what we're going to create. I'll just say get jobs, and it'll basically be a method that I'm about to create. And that is going to actually return a list of the job numbers. So we'll just go ahead and say returned job numbers. Okay. And then what I can do is for each string job number in return job numbers, then I can just go ahead and add that to the list view. So I'll just say list jobs.items.add job number. And I think you can actually do an add range for that as an array rather than doing this for each loop. But anyway, good enough. So it just shows you that when this function or this method returns the jobs from the PowerFab database, I'm going to add those to that list view here in the user interface. So you can see, just as a good programming practice, it's a good idea to keep as much of your user interface logic away from the actual like PowerFab API logic. So let me actually go into the ApplicationLogic class, and let's make a new method for that. So we'll say public, and list string is what's going to be returned with the job numbers, and we'll just say get jobs. Okay, so there's that new function or that new method. Now we need to come in here and define that new list. So we'll just say jobs, and we'll say return jobs. Okay, so now we need to do the actual code that connects to the PowerFab API and goes and fetches those jobs. So let's go back to our example. So we'll go to the example that we downloaded, and underneath this read production control jobs button. So again, if I come back here to the main form designer, double click on that, this is all the code when I press that button. So I don't want this production control jobs. This is actually like the list view on this particular application's dialog box, and I don't really want that. So I'm just going to copy this here. We'll copy all of that code, and then we'll go back over to my other code, and I'll paste that in here. Now there's some refactoring to do, just like on all the other ones. We got to get rid of those namespace references and things like that. And then looks like this list versus array stuff. So I will clean that up first, and then I'll come back and explain how this code works. Okay, so I refactored all the code, and there's one thing left to fix here. Instead of this list view from their code, I'm going to add the production control job numbers to my jobs list here. And that's actually being returned back to the user interface. So there we go. Okay, now let me actually explain how this works. So again, the entire structure of every one of these calls to the PowerFab API is you're going to make a XML request, and you're going to get very specific with what type of request are you going to put into that XML request. And that's where you get into the specific request parts of the API. So see this FS REQ. FS means Fab Suite or PowerFab, and then REQ for request. And then there's all of these different like sort of class objects for different types of data that you want to request. And in this case, I'm using get production control jobs. So how do you find out about which one you're supposed to use? Well, you can kind of look at the examples, and then you go back to the API documentation reference on the Tekla Developer Center, and that'll roughly tell you what type of objects you're dealing with, right? So here, this is very generic. It's all you're going to always have this top-level Fab Suite XML. I keep saying Fab Suite because the words are there. This PowerFab XML request, you'll always have this at the top. And then you're going to get more specific about the XML like string and type of request that you're putting into that generic request. And that's what kind of like you're adding here is you're adding this request and kind of getting more granular and specific. And then you call this execute command, and you pass the request to that, and then it's going to give you a response object that's going to be this generic Fab Suite XML response. Then what you try to do is, as long as there was no connection error and you did actually get a response, Then you start digging a little bit deeper into the response and you try to see if you can actually cast that XML in that response and actually come in here and get the specific response you were looking for. So up here in the request, I was trying to get production control jobs. But then in the response, I'm also calling a response, get production control jobs, and that'll look in the XML that was returned in the response and give me something in that XML that is going to actually be a C# object of production control job. Now, you may need to pause this and study the code and study the examples a couple of times, but the key thing in here that took me just a while that I made this video for is to just explain how this works. You're making an XML request, and then you're getting more granular or specific in the type of request. Then you call this ExecuteCommand method and you pass the request and then you get a response. And then you check if there's an error, like if anything went wrong, if that request was actually successful or not. And if it was, then on the request objects, that's what, or the response objects, that's what this FSRES is, you're going to have a matching production control jobs response to the production control jobs request. So you start with a request, you pass it to this execute command, you check whether the response is okay, that's what this is. If it is, then you cast it and try to set that XML to that specific response type, and then you go process and iterate through all those and do stuff with it. So here, this is basically saying if all this was successful, then what I'm going to do is I'm going to now start iterating through all of those production control jobs that were returned in the response, and I'm going to get information about them. So here is the production control job, and I'm getting that job number, and it's just like any other C# object where I can just iterate through whatever data that's returned. So again, if you need to pause it and rewatch this section a couple times, this is important. You have the request, you get very granular on the request, and then you execute that command and pass the request to it, which will generate a response. And then you cast that down or check and see if there's any errors, and you cast and compare that specific response that's very similar to the request object type, and then you start iterating through those and doing whatever you want to with that. So hopefully that makes sense from a data fetching point of view. So let's actually test this. I'm going to run the code. First, I need to connect. That looks good. Then I'm going to say get jobs, and voila, it gives me a list of the jobs right there. So there's the two different job numbers that I saw in PowerFab. And so again, how can I verify that? Well, let's go back to PowerFab. If I go to production control, there it is. There's my two job numbers, and that shows that I'm connecting to my specific database. Okay, so now that you've seen how to actually fetch jobs, now I'm going to show you a little bit more of an advanced application that I've already developed where I can go get additional information on that job. So what am I going to do? I'm going to go ahead and show you the end result here first. So I'm going to connect to the PowerFab database. Okay, so that looks good. It shows connected. Then I'm going to get the jobs. That looks good. There's the two jobs in my PowerFab database. I'll select on this job here. And now I'm going to have these other buttons which will fetch the specific data like schedule tasks or the cut lists that are associated to this specific selected job. So watch, I'll say get schedule. There's all the task items. Okay, and we can see all that there. Then I'll say get cut lists. And that shows me there's just one cut list, but that shows me all the top level data on that. Now I could then get additional data underneath that by just querying additional requests to find out the individual assemblies or bars and things like that that are associated to this cut list. But this is just showing you that top level object that's been returned. Okay, let's actually walk through how does this work. And you're going to see that it's very similar to the fetching the jobs with a request, execute command, and then process the response type of structure and scenario. So let's take a look. Okay, so let me step through the logic. First, I'm going to start with the get jobs. And here you can see that I've got my ApplicationLogic get jobs method. So I'll go ahead and say go to definition on that. And this is very similar to the other application, except for one key difference is instead of just adding the production control job number to a list that I'm going to show on the user interface, I'm actually storing that as a dictionary that I can look up later based on the selected job number from the user interface and actually go find the appropriate production control job that I already fetched from EPM based on that job number. So that's what this dictionary is here. So I'm just adding that as I iterate through all the production control jobs. I'm storing it and remembering based on the job number and remembering that particular production control job. Now, why am I going to use that? So let me show you. I'll go into the get cut lists. I'll just look at that code. So when I go to that button here, again, this is just some user UI information before I actually get in there, but I'm going to go down into this get cut list. So if I right click and say go to definition, that goes to this method. And look at this, it's kind of the same stuff over and over again, except for one key difference. First of all, I need to, I'm actually going to use this get project status. What's interesting is that with this get project status, I'm noticing in a lot of the examples, you can fetch all sorts of stuff that's on a project in this get project status. Like you can get cut lists from there, RFIs. I mean, there's all sorts of stuff that you can get with this get project status request. So again, we have the generic XML request up here at the top. Then we get very specific with the things that we want on this get project status. But what we have to pass to that is, guess what? The production control ID. And we got that from the production control jobs that we fetched in that other code I was just showing you. So from the dictionary, I'm actually getting the production control job ID from whatever's been selected on the dialog box. So see here, this selected job number, that's what the user selected on the dialog box. I pass that to this method here. And basically what I'm doing is from the dictionary, I'm just getting that production control job based on the selected job number. And now I can get that production control ID. So this is really important. This line here is super important to send to this get project status request so it knows which job am I supposed to be getting the project status for. So that's what's important here. Then there's this include cut lists flag, and it's technically like a 0 or 1 in the XML, but in order, I guess, to make this work with C#, they're doing this sort of as like a Boolean that then converts that into a 0, 1 integer for the XML. But either way, that's what you kind of have to set here. So I set this to true, so that way it will actually include the cut lists and the response. So there we go. Now we do the whole adding this specific get project status to the general XML request. Then we do the execute command, which then we pass that request to it. We get the response returned. We check to see if there's any XML errors or anything like that with in the response. If there's no errors, awesome. We're going to basically, from the response and the XML that's in there, we're going to try to cast that basically to the response get project status, which will have the actual cut lists in there. If all that is successful and correct, then I'm going to start looping through all of the cut lists that were returned in the response. And that's what we're seeing here. And then I'm just adding that to my list of return data, and I'm returning that to the user interface to display all the cut list data on my dialog box. So again, I will finish up with that everything in the PowerFab API is revolved around a request, and then you're going to execute the command from that request after you do the specific things related to that, and then you're going to get the response, and you'll check the response to see if there's any errors, and if no errors, then start iterating through that data and doing stuff with it. Now, again, just remember that when you're starting to get project-specific information, such as like, cut lists and tasks from a schedule and things like that, what you have to do is you have to tell it in this XML request for that get project status, you have to tell it the production control job ID number, so that way it knows which specific project that you're trying to fetch. And if you're trying to get data from lots and lots of projects to make a dashboard of your overall project status or station status of production out in the shop, then you iterate through all the jobs, and then you do fetches of get project status on each of those jobs. You cache all that data, and then you go put it into your dashboard application or database where you're going to show this information outside of PowerFab. So hopefully that gives you a great introduction here to how PowerFab works. Again, everything is based on this connect to the database using your credentials and the correct IP address, fetch the jobs. Then on each of the jobs, you'll start to do requests for specific information on the jobs. You'll then take that request, execute the command, and then process the response, which will give you that return data. Thanks for going through this introduction of the Tekla PowerFab API. Again, I'm Chris Keyack with Keyack Technology Solutions, and I'm a consultant that does implementation, administration, as well as custom programs, either as integrations or additional power tools on top of both Tekla structures and Tekla PowerFab. If you are in need of a developer or consultant to help get your developers up and running and going with either the Tekla Structures API or the PowerFab API, please feel free to reach out to me and we'll see how we can help you out.